Our panel is, can they steal the election? And then the answer is, of course they can. We're going to stop them, but of course they can. It's okay. I looked at them again. And I am joined on this great panel. Elisabeth Frost runs the litigation unit at Elias Law Group, which is our country's foremost defenders of the right to vote on so many fronts. Maurice Mitchell, who I don't think I ever had the pleasure to meet before today, although maybe we've been in green rooms, I've seen you on TV, runs the wonderful Working Families project and organization and party, and works to elect progressive, pro-democracy Democrats and pro-choice Democrats too. And Dahlia Lithwick literally needs no introduction. She's one of our greatest legal writers of all time at Slate. Her book, Lady Justice, must be read. And I haven't seen her since before the pandemic. And so that's what all the hugging's about. You know, it's like, gotta get those hugs in. So I want to, you're Liz, right? I want to start with Liz. You were described by your boss, Mark Elias, as kind of the air traffic controller for the way that they had to scramble in 40-something states to stop the various Republican plots to steal the election for Donald Trump in 2020. And so if you could just talk a little bit about what their playbook was last time, some of which we know, some of which I think you probably have a better overarching understanding, and then we'll talk a little later about what you're seeing now, because it's, you know, they evolve and change. So
yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much. So in 2020, it was about 15 states that were sort of the battleground for this, about 50-something lawsuits that we ended up having to defend against, obviously a completely unprecedented attack on the integrity of the nation's elections. And, you know, we saw a lot of the same themes. We saw arguments about fraud that were repeatedly proven to be completely and totally false, and yet that did not stop reattempts. In Arizona, for example, we had trouble actually naming the cases internally because first they brought this case that we called Sharpiegate, which was based on an allegation that voters were given Sharpies to vote their ballots and it wasn't being counted. After that got dismissed, they brought Sharpiegate 2 and 3. It was kind of like when you're writing something, right, and you give it a title, Last Time I Promise, right. Final version. And we saw those kinds of cases over and over again. We saw arguments that, you know, observers were not allowed to see things. We saw allegations from observers who were allowed to see things, who clearly just didn't understand how elections work. You know, and of course that then led into everything we're seeing now, which I think we're seeing similar kinds of attacks on completely legal election apparatuses. I think they're giving up a little of the voter fraud because it's incredible how they have not only not managed to prove that, but have sort of screwed themselves in the process. I'm litigating a case in Arizona right now, and you know, the Attorney General Brnovich set up the Election Integrity Unit, spent millions of dollars, an enormous amount of time combing the state for any evidence of this, and found literally nothing.
Or sometimes they find Republicans. I mean, I always laugh at, you know, these people who voted for Trump in 3 states, and you know, it doesn't exist. I think, you know, we all know this, Maurice. You know this. You see this. The sad fact for Republicans is if more of us vote, they lose. If they figure out ways to discourage our voters, thwart our voters, do legally or illegally, they win. And so how much has the Working Families Party dealt with this issue concretely and directly, and in what states do you feel like you're really up against it?
Sure. Also, thank you so much for the honor to be in conversation with all of you, and hello, audience. Yeah. Well, I want to answer that question, but also to take several steps back, because there's like so much information, so many details, and we could get lost in the minutia. But like Steve Harvey, he wrote, you know, Steve Harvey, the comedian.
Yeah.
So he wrote this book. It's like Think Like a Man, Act Like a Woman, right? And I think it's important for all of us to kind of, in order to get our minds right strategically, to think like a fascist, act like a patriot, right?
Are you writing that book?
Forthcoming, right? And what I mean by that is, like, we have to break our safe, liberal, rules-based imagination in order to really take seriously what they're doing. And in some ways, they focus laser-like on power, and we need to do the same. And our best defense can just be offense. So we have to, one of the things that they recognize is that a apathetic and nihilistic and cynical voter base is the place that they want to live on the right. And so a lot of the misinformation and disinformation isn't necessarily about getting people to migrate all the way to MAGA. A lot of it is about getting people to just drop out of the electorate. All of the money that they're spending in communities of color isn't necessarily because they think they could get a majority of Black or Latino men to become MAGA. They just need to get a margin to be confused enough or cynical enough not to show up, right? And so that's why we're offensively challenging all that. And to us, the way that you combat misinformation and disinformation isn't necessarily better information, although we need that. It's relationships, right? Inside of a relationship, inside of an organization, a labor union,
a church, synagogue,
organizations like the Working Families Party, you can have a thoughtful, value-based conversation that could challenge that misinformation and disinformation and challenge the cynicism that is the political project of the far right. And so sometimes we are trying to kind of fight information point by information point, and we're not going to win on that terrain. What we need to do is organize. And so we're doing that across many, many states, including many of the swing states. We're doing the deep organizing early so that we can protect working class voters of every race against some of these attacks and against all these conspiracy theories, which leads to a lot of cynicism. And like, why vote if there's some cabal that is somehow pulling the strings? Why vote if it's going to be stolen from me? And so that's why we really need to engage in the deep organizing work to begin with.
I think that's so important. I was talking to, during the 22 cycle, a Black friend who runs a voter education group in Georgia, Crucial, Georgia, and she has a son who is 21, of voting age. He's a gamer. He's a kid, a young man, and luckily they have a really good relationship. So he is literally showing her what YouTube is showing him when he's not even searching for this garbage, but they are gradually serving him up why the Democratic Party hates you and why. I mean, you go back to 2016 and all the disinformation about Hillary Clinton that was designed to make young Black men in particular think, she'd written the crime bill and she personally put millions of men in jail. So it's the chicanery, the legal stuff they do, but it's also the mind stuff they do and whatever it takes. Dahlia, you've written about this on so many levels, and I'm just wondering, we can go back to the 2000 election and the Florida recount and all the things we learned in that horrible process. I was at Salon, and we ran a story about how the Secretary of State at the time, Republican Katherine Harris, some of you are old enough to remember that name, they had purchased a list of felons. Now, at this point, felons were not allowed to vote. They should be allowed to vote, in my opinion. That law has changed. But they purchased this list, and it's just like, if there was a Joan Walsh in some part of Florida who was a felon, I can't vote. And it wasn't happening to Joan Walsh, by the way. You can probably guess who it was happening to. So, we've been fighting it for so long, but you're seeing new levels of innovation, legal innovations now that are so anti-voting and anti-democratic. I wanted you to talk about some of them.
I think it's a version of what Liz said, which is you're always fighting the last war, right? So we have now cottoned on to the fact that there is vote suppression, right? Stuff that has been going on for decades, right? Don't forget people who are trying to vote when Stacey Abrams ran in Georgia the first time and were getting, thrown off the polls for not having an accent over their name, right? So this is old school. And so I think part of the problem is that we act as though that's the thing that was happening 15 years ago that is happening, except the thing that's happening now is not vote suppression, it's democracy subversion. Vote suppression, that's like, you can only knock so many voters off the rolls, right?
They'll still try. They just did it in Virginia last week.
And they're going to still close Sunday voting, and they're still going to try to make vote by mail impossible. I'm not suggesting it's gone, but I want to suggest that if that's the ball you're looking at, you're going to get hit in the head by a pitch, because what we're seeing now is actual democracy subversion, which is really different, which is we're going to impeach the newly elected Supreme Court justice in Wisconsin. What's the predicate for impeachment? Don't care. We are going to make sure that elected officials in Tennessee in the state house simply can't express their will or the will of the electorate. Why? How? Don't care. Turn off their microphones. And so every time you see, for me, the sort of low water mark of this is stuff like the independent state legislature theory, that was floated and failed at the Supreme Court. But you don't have to knock voters off the rolls if you can simply say, oh, actually the Constitution says that your state legislature can just send a fake ballot of fake electors, and that's the law now. And so I think we have to be really careful to not just, which is why you have the hardest job, not just fight vote suppression and efforts to throw folks off the poll, and not just fight the cynicism that is deliberately planted that allows people to say, what is government doing for me? But I think we're seeing, and this is, by the way, like the sort of authoritarian rule book, right? Like you have to migrate and evolve to be more and more focused on power as opposed to democracy, because even if you purge votes, even if you challenge votes, there was a creepy article in the Times today about what Virginia is doing in terms of poll watchers. Like, don't read it, you'll sob. But I think we have to be just really mindful of the fact that that's small ball compared to completely subverting how democracy works. And I don't say that from a place of joy, but no. I say that from a place of, if we think that the stakes are the same as they were in 2020, when an actual insurrection attempted to thwart power, we're way past even that.
Right. Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, which is it's true. Like, everything new is actually old. These are all the tactics that we've been seeing since Jim Crow. And, a lot of our voter work actually grew out of the fact that we were recount lawyers first. And so we'd sit at these tables and we'd see what kinds of so-called neutral election laws were actually causing ballots to be not counted. And, I think one of the things that we're starting to see now, it's the whole reason the Voting Rights Act was enacted was to stay ahead of the vote suppressors, right? And now we don't have that safeguard in the same way. And one of the things we're starting to see that's relatively new this cycle, just to give you one example of how they're reinventing the wheel in this way, is we've seen now in at least 2 states, and we have litigation pending in both, Arizona and Montana, where they are criminalizing having a voter registration in more than one state. So many Americans have voter registrations in more than one state. It's not even clear in a lot of states how you can get rid of your old voter registration when you move.
I've never done it.
Right. This is totally innocent conduct. There's no intent requirement that you're planning to double vote. There's no requirement that you double vote. And they are criminalizing it. So that's where I say they're turning away from the there actually was voter fraud. And now if you look at their legal pleadings, you see they've stopped using the word fraud a lot. They use it sometimes, they love that word, but have started to use illegal voting. And then they use their positions of power to define what is illegal.
I find that so fascinating. You said something else in our email exchange before we met today about their focus in some states on younger voters in particular. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing on that front.
Yeah, I mean, the midterms were not great for Republicans, right?
No.
And in a lot of ways, that was because of young voters. And of course, political scientists smarter than I will tell you that part of the reason we're seeing this is because people are looking at the demographics and they know what's coming. And at some point, I know young voters, everyone says, well, everyone thinks they're going to show up, and then they don't, but they're starting to show up. And honestly, they're starting to age into the area when they will show up. And so this is a great example of these voter registrations, because younger voters are more mobile than middle-aged or elderly voters who tend to stay in the same place, right? So you move from one state to another, and you still have your voter registration, and now suddenly you're a criminal, or you can't register to vote. And so that kind of stuff is, I think, very astutely targeted at the types of voters they really don't want to vote.
You also see, talking about fighting the last war, but one of the things that is so tragic in so many ways, the voter education groups, the groups like Maurice's that have worked on the ground with voters, in Georgia, they learned how to ballot cure, so that if there was something wrong with your registration and you were rejected or you found yourself not on the polls, there were actually people who would go around, virtually house to house, apartment building, helping people, Mr. Jones, you didn't, sign the back of your envelope correctly, but you can do it now. Every time people, first of all of that, sometimes it's done in the frame of a relationship, and that's great. But sometimes it's not done. It's done on the fly. It needs to be done. But all of that is time that people could be putting into really talking about issues, really developing the relationships we're talking about, preaching for their candidate. And it feels like in Georgia in particular, even after, Brad Raffensperger and to some extent Brian Kemp became sort of heroes to non-MAGA Republicans for how they stood up to who, they went ahead and changed the laws in ways that made voting harder. Even as they said, we had a perfectly clean election. We had record turnout. They shut down polling places like the State Farm Arena in Atlanta. They shut down all these really great innovations. They made it illegal for private businesses, who too often do intervene on the wrong side, but to do anything materially to help create new polling situations. It's just like, we have to do this, we get good at doing it, and then it's like, nope, we're going to change those rules again. And I'm wondering, if you've seen that on the ground too.
Yeah, Joan, and I think, to the earlier comment around trying to take a longer arc around history, none of this started January 6th. This started 1776, right? In some ways, because nobody here could vote, right? And so we do this thing, especially on our side, where we almost normalize structural sort of degradation of our fundamental democratic values and our democratic institutions. And we were successful last cycle. The red wave didn't happen, but under some of the most undemocratic structures that we take, the voter ID laws, we just accept. We live in a country where that's acceptable, right?
Go out and help help your neighbor find her birth certificate or whatever she has to do.
Sure.
Groups do it.
Partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering, we just accept. Our side just accepts it as kind of, we just bake it into how we do business. And in some ways, we have to proximally deal with the rules as they are. But every time we get, and I think the right wing does this very well, every time they have governing power, the first thing they do is change the rules.
Right.
Oftentimes, when our side has governing power, we lose sight of the fact that we're in a setting where the rules over 40, 50 years they almost have run the map with us around changing the rules and valuing the few, valuing the ultra wealthy, valuing corporations, making it harder for racial minorities, black folks specifically, to vote. And we have to do the work of, once we gain governing power, changing back the rules. The idea that DC is not a state, but the 2 Dakotas have 4 senators,
right,
we just accept that.
Right.
anybody outside of the United States understanding our system of governance, I mean, and we somehow want credibility as being these arbiters of democracy.
Right.
And so we have work to do every step of the way in terms of, first of all, doing the proximal things so that we win every single election, so that neo-fascists don't take governing power. But when we have governing power, we need to ensure that the rules are changed and we move back to not just a quote-unquote rules-based, but a people-based, truly democratic society.
Right. I mean, it's not exactly voting related, but, you know, Democrats control the Senate, and yet they're letting Tommy Tuberville get away with stopping all of these military appointments. Dick Durbin runs judiciary, but still lets Republicans block Biden's court picks. Why? I mean, you know, we're not working for them. I guess that's part of why we...
Imagine Republicans having a majority in the Senate and behaving in this fashion. It's like, when Republicans lose, they act like they win.
Right.
When Democrats win, they lose the will to use power. And we need to be able to breathe some light into the majorities when we gain them.
Right. You were going to say something? I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, I think it's another way of saying exactly what you said, which is we like to sort of swan around and say this is the best functioning, freest democracy in the world. And at the same time, every piece of it, from the Electoral College to the Senate to the filibuster rule, is functioning exactly as intended, which is to not be maximizing of democracy, not maximizing of one person, one vote. That's why we just sit around and say, oh, gerrymandering, I guess that's okay, it's always been done. There's no part of the way we are doing elections in democracy, including, by the way, like election day itself, including, by the way, you know, the way the dark money is polluting this entire conversation. No other democracy in the world looks at the way we have systematically subverted majority rule, and don't even get me started on the Supreme Court. But no other country in the world is like, I want more of that. That seems like a good thing. This is a system that was designed so that white slaveholding men in the South could maximize power for themselves, and all these years later, it's still kind of working to do that.
Yep. Liz, you were about to say something.
I was just going to say, I think it's a phenomenal point that you made about how the last election turned out the way it is despite all the restraints in the system. And I think it actually also dovetails with the point you made at the outset, which is that this, because of all of these restraints, it actually makes it hard to see how successful the organizing is, right? And how successful voters have been in pushing this back. And I think one of the concerns that I have is the point you made at the top, which is that people see this and they say, oh, but why was it so close? You know, never mind that actually when all the votes were counted, it wasn't that close at all. But, you know, why wasn't it more of a blowout? And like, it's all of these sort of invisible restraints so that then can make people feel like, gosh, but I tried and it didn't happen. And I think one of the things that I constantly think about in the work that I do is for decades, civil rights lawyers walked into courtrooms with no hope that a judge would ever rule on their side. But they did it anyway. And I think it's one of the things we always have to remember is that you can't think like, oh, well, why didn't we survive by a larger margin? Or why did we lose that election? Like, this is a long fight, and it is going to continue to exist for a long time. And we all have to be committed to it.
And to that, yes. And to that point, you know, everybody, like I feel like every cycle we see those images of long lines, specifically of black working class folks who are standing for hours to vote. And we congratulate folks for this, and we consider them courageous, and they are. But instead of congratulating them, we should be mad as hell. Then in 2023, any voter, especially black voters in the South, like in Georgia, have to do that have to suffer that indignity in the United States.
Yeah, we're really good at celebrating the heroism, but we're not as good at getting rid of the underlying injustice. We have like less than 30 seconds. What gives you hope lightning round. It'll be short.
I mean, I gotta say, voters give me hope. I think the fact that for a long time was an argument about whether you even highlight the fact that this was even happening out of fear that it would scare voters away. Instead, voters are standing up and they're fighting back, and the awareness, I think, has really helped us. Yeah. And that gives me a lot of hope.
Good.
So last cycle, 2020, we trained more than 10,000 people across 10 states in order to be election defenders, and we did Joy to the Polls, where we elevated our joy and we danced the Trumpist out of Philly, and that energy times 10 is what we're going to bring to 2024. Woo. That brings me hope.
More joy to the polls. Dahlia.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say 2 words, Taylor Swift, right? I mean, in the course of like a nanosecond, gets all these little kids to be doing friendship bracelets and registering to vote. I mean, to your point, young people are a juggernaut, and, they don't have a landline, so they don't answer the pollsters who call their not existing landline, but they actually really care, and maybe just sort of ancillary to that, but I think it's important. Somebody said earlier this morning, the 2022 election was a referendum on democracy itself.
Absolutely.
That Moore v. Harper case was a referendum on democracy itself. I think that voters, as it turns out, kind of really like democracy. And when you threaten to take it away by way of a coup, or vote suppression, or by way of shutting souls to the polls, or whatever happens, we keep seeing that the corrective to that is not a policy corrective. It's just angry voters who show up in droves. So I think that voters have skin in the game in a way that they didn't used to, because they're not blind and they see what the game is.
Right. On that note, I want to thank our great panel. This has been amazing. We could talk forever.